Este episodio de La Trinchera es presentado por La Tigre. Sabemos que los códigos de vestimenta en los espacios profesionales se han puesto algo casual, pero no podemos olvidar que una imagen bien curada puede aportar a nuestro progreso profesional. Detrás de La Tigre se encuentra un selecto grupo de expertos en moda y estilo personal que te ayudarán a elaborar una imagen que cuente tu historia de éxito. Con opciones de ropa a la medida y al detalle de origen italiano para él, y colecciones de Europa para ella, La Tigre es moda para una nueva generación que aprecia el valor que una imagen de progreso puede aportar a nuestras vidas. En mi caso, para mí siempre ha sido importante portar piezas a la medida de La Tigre, dadas mis comparecencias públicas y en los medios. Y ustedes que me han visto en los periódicos o en televisión, saben muy bien que mis chaquetas, mis camisas, mis pantalones y mis corbatas de La Tigre me hacen lucir muy monarca. Visiten la boutique de La Tigre, ubicada en Ciudadela, en Santurce, o síganlos en Instagram en Shop La Tigre. La Tigre es un estilo en función de progreso y auspiciador de este programa. Bienvenidos a La Trinchera, yo soy Cristian Sobrino y en este episodio nos galardona y honra con su presencia el Mussolini, el Duce de todos los asuntos fiscales de Puerto Rico, el Director Ejecutivo de la Junta de Supervisión Fiscal, el licenciado, pero no practicante, don Roberto F. Mujica Jr. Bienvenido.
Gracias, Cristian.
How are you doing?
Todo bien, todo bien.
Todo bien. We're going to do the interview I might ask questions in Spanish or in English, but you answer in whichever you like. You can understand both, right?
Sí, perfecto, gracias.
Okay. How's the day going?
Very good so far.
You were late.
No, I was listening to Radiocast, listening to your questions. I was downstairs in the parking lot, so I wasn't really late. I just came up here.
You were late to the office, though. What's Radiocast?
What's that?
What's Radiocast?
What do you mean, what's Radiocast?
I don't know. You mean like on the radio?
Oh, yeah.
It's like an app or something.
Well, there's a whole thing going on regarding, Luma and what's going on there. So I just wanted to get a sense as to what's going on.
El Transformador.
Yes.
Sounds like a cargo cult, doesn't it? We're worshiping machines. ¿Cuál es tu rol en eso?
Look, I think the board's going to have to take a more active role in just making sure that there is execution. Where the board is not happy, I don't think the people of Puerto Rico are happy with the progress that is being made with regard to the energy transformation. And I think I want to get a better understanding as to what's going on. What are the obstacles to moving forward, and how can we accelerate the process? So I'm going to reserve, what the next steps are going to be. But today I'm going to bring together the heads of both Luma, Genera, the government as well, to discuss kind of where we are and where we're going.
Esta entrevista sale el miércoles de la semana entrante. Así que para los que están escuchando, esto el viernes, el día después de que se anunció el asunto del transformador de Santa Isabel, no estaba funcionando. Así que so that meeting is going to happen today.
Yes.
Yeah, today, Friday. How did you think energy was going to be a big thing on your plate when you came down?
I did. However, I thought that more progress was being made than where we are today. So I always thought that having a functioning electrical grid is important for...
You would think, right?
Economic development. It's important for anything, right? It's a conditioned precedent to moving forward. I probably thought there was more progress made. But we're still in bankruptcy. But that can't stop, right, the grid. And the monies have been allocated. So my frustration is it's not a resource issue. It's an execution issue. And I want to understand, how we move forward. And do we have all the resources that we need to move forward? I want to get a better understanding of that.
Sí, yo y para los que están escuchando, ¿verdad? También algo que yo aprendí atendiendo todos los temas que tenían que ver con energía es que yo tengo una filosofía de que los problemas tienen número de seguro social. Either somebody's doing what they should be doing or they're doing what they're not supposed to be doing, or something's blocking the parade, right? And with the way sometimes the public discussion in Puerto Rico works, everything tries to get personal very quickly. And there's a blame game that's going on always versus just trying to identify what the issue is and solving for it. And then people start covering because they don't want to be made into a laughingstock or be shown as incompetent when maybe they're not. I think people need to get in a room. I think I completely agree with that approach. I think, and it can't be in a room with a camera on. It needs to be with like a room, like people having like an honest discussion, then coming to a conclusion. So I hope that works out. So let's go to the actual interview that we had planned doing. I'm interested in where you're from. What's your background? What led you to become such a budget and fiscal nerd and working 30 years in this area in New York State? Like, where are you from?
Yeah. I grew up in New York City. So that is where I am from. My family are all from Puerto Rico.
Arecibo, ¿verdad?
Arecibo. And both, my mother and my father are both from Arecibo. However, they didn't meet until they moved to Williamsburg in Brooklyn. So it's a typical story, I think. They left Puerto Rico for opportunity. They lived in El Campo, in Esperanza, in Arecibo. And I spent my summers there.
Every summer, like when you were a little kid, high school?
Yeah, most of my summers when I was growing up, I spent there. Most of the time in Arecibo, either on the beach. My father's from the beach towns. My mother's from the Campo. And as I got older, right, then I kind of wanted to be in the city a little bit more. So I spent more time in San Juan.
Cigarettes and beer.
I had a lot of fun in San Juan when I was up until my 20s, right? And then from there I went to graduate school, and then I went to law school. You know, you don't have as much time, right, to spend. But I came here often. My grandparents lived here. They moved to New York, and then they moved back.
Are they still around? To
Puerto Rico. My grandfather passed a couple years ago. My grandmother is still here. She was in Puerto
Does she get excited to see you in the newspaper?
Yeah, she does.
She does a scrapbook. My grandmother made a scrapbook.
She's very excited. She was just here for 2 months.
Okay.
She just went back into New York, and she comes back, and I take care of her place in Arecibo.
But you're not living right now in Arecibo. You're more closer to the office.
That's right. Yeah.
And you were raised in Brooklyn, Bronx, Staten Island. Where exactly?
All three. So I moved around a lot. So I was born in Brooklyn. From there, my father lived in the Bronx. So I spent half my time growing up, or a quarter of my time growing up, in the South Bronx. In the South Bronx at a time, in the 70s and the 80s, the South Bronx was a tough place.
Yeah.
And I would actually travel, when my mother eventually moved to Staten Island, I would actually travel from Staten Island to the South Bronx on the trains almost every weekend. So that's like traversing all of New York.
Yeah.
And you see everything, right, on the way there. My grandmother on my father's side lived in the South Bronx. And there was a time when the South Bronx was a tough place. Things were on fire, lots of crime, right? And that was, so I grew up in these two different places, right? Staten Island,
it's suburban, right? It's like Italian.
One of the safest, right? Most suburban areas of New York City. Some people think it's not even, right? It's very different. And then I would go to, right, the South Bronx, which is probably the most inner city, right? Yeah. And so that, informed, my view, right, of New York City. And also there's a very strong Puerto Rican community in the Bronx. And a lot of my father's family, was there. So I got from both sides. For my mother, it was very important for me to be able to go to good schools. Education was extraordinarily important. She instilled in me that, no matter what we do, she wanted to make sure I was going to good schools. And that was part of, I think, the moving was, where do we go where we can go to.
What about culture? Like, what was the because you mentioned of the Puerto Rican community in the Bronx, Staten Island, education. Like, what was there a big focus on keeping like Puerto Rican culture or being more adapted to the melting pot? Like, what was that conversation at home like?
Sure. I think had both. So my father was very focused on make sure that I've maintained my Puerto Rican roots, make sure I can, speak Spanish and language. My mother was very focused on, there was a lot of prejudice, right, at that time, especially where I was, right?
Like what kind, like against blacks, Latinos, like that thing?
When I went to school, I was probably the only Puerto Rican in some of my classes. Right?
Okay.
So I've never seen like a Puerto Rican. What was he Indian? Is he Puerto Rican? Right? What? Exactly. What is that? Right?
Which is funny what you mentioned because the first time I saw you, like looks Puerto Rican. But now that you mention it, you do have the whole Hindu Kamala Harris thing going on.
So for someone who has never seen a Puerto Rican before, right, I'm in that world, right? I'm living in that world. But then when I was with my father's, right, everyone's Puerto Rican. We were hanging out in the parks in St. Mary's Park in the South Bronx, and everyone's speaking Spanish. So it's both of those. But it was very important for my mom to make sure that I was educated, make sure that I went to places where I wasn't going to experience all the prejudice that, maybe she experienced when she first came here from Puerto Rico, right? Because she came during that time of the 50s and the 60s when, Puerto Ricans are moving into Williamsburg and Brooklyn, right? And there were challenges in those neighborhoods, and there was challenges between, the expectations of what people saw as this, a migrant community that really isn't, right? Because we're so proud, right, of everything. And my father was always very proud of being Puerto Rican.
Did you watch In the Heights?
I did.
You like it?
I did. I did. It's like, you look at the West Side Story has a lot of prejudices to it, right? And it's like the modern version, right, of that. West Side Story at the time was controversial for Puerto Ricans, right? Because there were a lot of stereotypes in there.
And Maria sings, I want the island to go down into the ocean, which is...
Yes.
I saw it a couple of years ago when they put it over here. It was a little dated. I thought the ending was horrible because I was like, what do you mean they're going to mortgage their whole business just so that she can go study something stupid in college? Like it was... Did you see... When I went to school in Boston, there were people, Puerto Ricans that lived, that like you, they were raised in New York or somewhere else, like Pennsylvania or something. And they had this vision of Puerto Rico as very rural. They didn't, which Puerto Rico still has rural parts, right? But the metro area is like a bombed out metropolis, right? And there was always this tension between what they were told Puerto Rico was before what we actually saw. Do you see that tension now?
I didn't see it because I've known Puerto Rico for what it is my whole life.
Because you're raised.
Because I was here all the time, right? And I spent time both in the cities and I spent time in the rural areas. So I knew both. And it's not that different for me from New York in the sense that New York is a big city and it has very rural areas, right? And I think people get stuck in, where they're from. I've moved around enough to understand that there's both. And in the political process, right, there are people in the cities who have different views, different lifestyles. And there are people in rural areas who have different views and different lifestyles. And I was used to that. So for me, there wasn't I didn't see that tension or difference. It is no different than any other place where there's a city and there's a rural population. People who don't understand it don't know that. But once you're here, I'm looking at your window right here, right? This is a city.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have a country.
Is it weird that New York's turned into Disneyland from what you grew up?
Well, the beginning of when I grew up there, it was pretty bad, right? I mean, you had Times Square was, you didn't want to walk through Times Square. Then it got cleaned up and became a new area. Now it's this Disneyland area, and it's so crowded. It's so crowded now. I spent 20 years in upstate New York, so I lived in Albany for a long time, and I was able to go back and forth into New York City. So I love New York City, but I love actually being able to be outside and in the countryside.
And how did you end up working in budgets? How did you end up in the legislature?
Yeah. After graduate school, so I went to...
Because I saw in an interview that you did a while back, you thought you were going to end up being like a banker.
Yeah. Wall Street was booming when I graduated from Brooklyn College in New York City. Then I went to graduate school in University of Pennsylvania. And when I ended, the question was, where was I going to go?
Mm-hmm.
And going to go back to New York City, or was I going to go someplace else? And I had interned in the budget office in
the city, right?
New York City.
Yeah.
Right. And my mother actually had worked there. So
what did she do?
She was the assistant to the budget director at the time.
Big job.
Right. Yeah. So I was in undergrad, and I was still in Brooklyn College, and I had interned there 6 months, and then that was it. Then I went to graduate school. But the budget director for New York City ended up becoming the secretary to the finance committee at the state level.
Is that the same as the executive director of the committee?
Yeah, it would be like because
here that's what you're called. Here, if you're like the staff position that leads the committee, you're the executive director.
So then that would be the same position. So he became that. So I kept in touch with him. And so I decided I was going to either go with a lot of friends who were going to Wall Street to make a lot of money, or, go into the legislature. And the decision was really, there's a lot of activity going on at the state level at the time. Like a lot of power was being shifted from the federal government to state governments.
What year is this?
This is in the late 90s.
Late 90s? No, I think it's early.
Early 90s, yeah. So there's a lot of devolution going on to there. So I said, this is an exciting time to be at the state level. I'll do it for 2 years. Yes. 19
years later.
I did it. Right. So that's right. So I did it for 2 years, and 20 years later, I was still there. And I said, I came to Albany for 2 years. 20 years ago. But I don't regret a single day. I enjoyed it. And the reason I stayed is because I'm enjoying what I do. I'm learning all the time, and I always enjoyed it. So I had, zero regrets. It's exactly where it was supposed to be. And while I was there, I had a finance background, right, from my undergrad education. And I learned that there's basically three kinds of in government and in probably any organization. You have the communication side, you have the legal side, and you have the finance side. And sometimes there's tension, right, between those groups. I was the finance person. I didn't like getting told by the lawyers what you can and can't do. So I went to law school.
So that you could just fight with them.
Exactly. I went to law school so I could say, you can't really, well, you're the legal side, so I have to defer to you.
Yeah.
So for that reason, I went to law school and become a lawyer. Now I have the finance side. Now I have the legal side. And I can cut through the BS, frankly, of the lawyers.
And it's fun, I bet, because you can say, like, excuse me, the case doesn't say that bullshit.
That's exactly the reason I did it. Because they'd say it with authority, and unless you had the ability to push back, right, you couldn't. Yeah. So that's why I went to law school, and I did it while I was working. So I was working for the finance committee, and I had people that allowed me to go to school at the same time, and I would run back and forth between the Capitol and law school, which was about 2 miles away. And I would literally drive between classes so that I could do my work and go to law school. And after that, I just stayed there, and that was my 20-year trajectory.
Is it weird that, because I know that in those years, Republicans controlled the Senate. I think your House was different, right? There was a little more interplay there, but it's kind of weird for me to see somebody, a Puerto Rican from New York, hangando con los republicanos.
Yeah.
La mafia puertorriqueña es demócrata. Didn't you get the memo, buddy?
Yeah. It's interesting because the interesting part about it, I think, was...
First, are you political, though?
I wasn't political.
Yeah.
I didn't know anyone in really politics there. So I was able to, climb up the ladder just because I worked hard. And I believe that's what it was, right? And it wasn't because I was Puerto Rican, and it wasn't because I had necessarily anyone who was bringing me up. It was, I worked really hard. I was loyal. I was trusting, and I always listened, right? And the Republicans at the time, who I started working with, as an analyst at the finance committee, kept promoting me up. And it was never a thing that I was working for Republicans. I was just working for my principles, which I think is why I was able to work for Republicans for 19 years and then worked for Democrats, right, for another 7, 8 years. And I think if you'll see that it was because I always was able to bridge the gap between the two. Because in government, unlike today, but back then, right, the goal was we had to get something done. And when you had a divided government, Republicans controlling one house, Democrats controlling another house, whether it was Democrat or Republican in the governor's seat, we had to get to a budget deal every year. We had to get to deals every year. And that means that staff would sit in the room, partisanship aside, right? How can we get to yes that for all of our principles? And that is what I was able to accomplish and help get to. And I think that is why I was able to go from Democrat to Republican, because it wasn't about being partisan, right? It was about how do we govern well.
Did they call you a traitor when you went to work for Cuomo?
So, yeah, I was afraid. That was one of the most difficult decisions, right? Yeah. Because there was an adversarial relationship between the Republicans, right, where I worked, and the Democratic governor at the time. And Governor Cuomo and I had sat across the table, and we were adversaries. Right? Mm-hmm. But there was a mutual respect because of having to get something done. And I helped get the deals done. And I was afraid that when I left, right, there would be your switching. Mm-hmm. But that never happened, actually. The people I worked for were very respectful, and they actually were congratulatory, and they felt like this was a natural next move from running the fiscal committee in the legislature, right, to being the budget director for New York State, right? New York's the 10th, one of the largest economies in the world, right? It was natural, and they thought it was a good career move. And I still maintain those relationships today, and I built new ones.
Y la cultura política. So what's the political culture like? First of all, was it different, do you think, how it was in the 90s when you were coming up to how it is now? And because you always mention getting things done, deals done. Cultura en Puerto Rico, we'll drive the car off the cliff. So we don't give a shit, right? That's part of the issues that we've had fiscally, right? Nobody actually needs to get to a deal. We can just crash the car. ¿Cómo era la cultura política allá?
Yeah. When I was there in the beginning, you had 20 years of late budgets and a process where the people...
Can you explain what a late budget is?
The fiscal year ended over there on April 1. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a budget in place. So it would be like not having a budget in place on July 1. What do? You shut down the government. And there was always these threats of shutting down the government. 20 consecutive years of this. There was a dysfunction that existed. And the people were tired of government dysfunction. And it wasn't about Democrat, Republican. It was about you all, right, are you dysfunctional. All suck, yeah. Exactly. So I was there during the times when I was, lower staff level in the beginning of that. And then when I moved up, we did budget reforms in order to get past that. And we fixed it. So we went from 20 years of late budgets to 10 years of on-time budgets. We went from a time when there was overspending to a time when the budgets increased at only 2% a year for a decade. We went through a time when we had very high amounts of debt to putting in a debt caps. And we went from a time when I was there to actually getting our bond rating, right, increased to the highest level in over 50, 60 years. So I was there during that transition. So when you talk about getting things done, I think there was a time then when people were more interested and less polarized than they are today. And this is in national politics. I think it's at state level politics where people just want to be right. Yeah. And they don't want to compromise. Yeah. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge right now in politics, is that there is the extremes of both parties, right, are dominating the discussion. Most people are probably in the middle, and they don't want to reach a compromise, right? They want to be right. When I was there, everyone got in a room we want to do a deal. And I think that's still possible. And I think that's possible here. Even in my experience here, meeting with the elected officials and even meeting some of the legislators. Inside the room, right? They get it. They get outside the room, things become more political and you don't necessarily, right, get to a good place because people are afraid of being criticized and populism. What pressured New York State and the city to get into that ese tracto de pensamiento, ¿verdad? I think people take for granted that New York is New York now, but at least when I was a little kid, New York was a shit show. It was complete disaster of governance. And now we think it's always been very, very practical and it's competent, etc. Like what was the pressure? Was it the voter? Yeah.
Was it the federal government? Was it control boards in the city? Like what was the actual thing that pressured your bosses to doing that kind of level governance?
History is really important to understand. In the 1930s, the legislature almost bankrupted the state.
Mm-hmm.
There was a big budget reform that was done at that time. That reform process still exists today. That's in the 30s. New York City, then in the 70s, almost went bankrupt. President said,
Drop dead.
And they had to figure it out on their own. The reforms that were done at that time are still in place today. I lived with them when I was budget director. When I was budget director, we still had rules in place that were done as part of the reforms. The state also had challenges with the authorities spending too much money, issuing too much debt. We had to reform ourselves. You needed strong leadership in order to get these things done, right? I'm a staff person. I need to have strong leaders around in order to get those things done. And that's what we had. People were tired. We almost went bankrupt. You had to raise taxes. So choices become, are you going to raise taxes or are you going to reform the system? There's only so much that people can tolerate. So what changed was, right, people were done. New York's not affordable anymore. You can't raise taxes anymore. The days of overspending, right, are gone. So how do we fix that? And that's the reforms. Crisis brought the reforms.
But it's an electoral pressure is what I'm I think I'm understanding.
Yep.
That the voter said, I'm going to start punishing you if you act like a jackass. Now, the question I have is that pressure on the governor? For me, it's a little hard to imagine because New York is a very large state.
Mm-hmm.
So Albany, for me, feels like it's forever away, right? And the legislature and the governor are there. They're not in the city. Mm-hmm. And then they're not close to anybody. Like, is it a quieter political atmosphere? Is the legislature weaker vis-a-vis the governor? Like, where is that pressure being applied?
The reform almost always comes from the executive.
Mm-hmm.
Because the executive has to look at the entire state.
Mm-hmm.
The legislature is made up of a lot of individuals who report to their own districts. So, what often happens is, I don't like any of the politicians, but my guy is the good guy.
Yeah.
Right?
The same here with the mayors. Everybody hates every other mayor except their own.
Right. Everyone is bad except for my person.
Yeah.
And legislators make decisions that way, right, on what's best for my community. The governors and the statewide electeds have to make the decisions like, we need to reform for the entire state. And then there's that tension that exists between the executive and the legislature. And I see the same thing here.
Mm-hmm.
Individual legislators tend to be not as responsible for the global view as the governor needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
That's the tension, and that's what has to change. Or you have the leaders in the legislature, right, with the governor saying, we recognize that for the future of Puerto Rico, the future of New York, we need to make reforms. And I think that's kind of the stage where we are today, right, is how do we make permanent reforms and get the legislature to understand that these are needed and get the executive to understand that we have to push for these, because if you don't, you're going to go back to what happened before. And I'm not one to say, like, to dwell on the past, but you do have to remember how we got here. And there were at least 16 consecutive years between 2000 and 2016, when preparación was done, of the budget being passed and then overspending in every single one of those years in a row. And you then fast forward to this year. And so what happened? We were negotiating a budget, and the legislature's passing, right, $800 million outside of the budget. $800 million on a budget that's $13.7 billion. That can't be. And I had some strange conversations where people say, well, that's the way we do it here. All right. We do a budget, and then there's this other stuff. Well, but and then it became very clear to me.
And did they look at you like, don't you get it? Like, that's simply how it is.
Well, it's like, but that's what everyone else does. But it's not, right? I mean, I did it for a very long time, right? But that is the recipe for bankruptcy, right? Pass a budget one day, and then we spend the rest of the year passing spending bills, and then we're out of balance. And then what do? You cut spending. Well, there's no desire to do that. So we ended up borrowing and doing other things. But I at least now understand how it's clear that process is broken. And that's what I said when I wrote this letter. I said that it's clear that the budget process is broken. So now it's how do we fix that process? And I think that is something that can be done. You may need statutory changes. We may need budget reforms to the budget process. And that's when I said in New York, we have had multiple budget reforms, because whenever we saw that there was a problem and a crisis developed as a result of overspending, late budgets, there was a reform that was done, and that enabled us to kind of move forward. So you're right. It hasn't always been going well, right? And that is the case for other places too, right? So it's not, Puerto Rico's not the only place to have had fiscal challenges. New York had them. California had them. Washington, D.C. had them. Detroit had them. And there are many other municipalities that have had them. The difference is going to be how you recover from them and what you learn from that crisis. All of those places haven't gone back to that because they made the reforms necessary. And I think that's the same thing for Puerto Rico. There can be no way to go back to that, but you have to acknowledge that something went wrong, and then you have to fix it.
What other differences have you seen in the political culture here versus what you saw in New York? I mean, you gave an example. It's always we pass a budget, but we spend outside of it. It's like, what's another difference that you've seen? I'll give you an example. When I would speak with Natalia Yaresco, she would say, Christian, it's really weird because your private sector sucks. Like they really don't say anything. Like, and she always would compare it with Ukraine. Like that was something that she was very fixated on. The private sector here, it's not very active. Like what stuff have you seen that's called your attention?
I think there are lots of things that actually are more similar than we want to acknowledge. There are many times when I've sat in a room with either the governor or legislative leaders, and I'm hearing the same conversation. Like these are the same conversations I've had before, which is helpful because I can understand how we can, navigate beyond that. The tension between the executive and the legislature is institutional, not necessarily partisan. And I think that always has to be remembered. So you do have, the legislature's ability to pass spending, and the executive needs to have the willingness to stop it and have that be sustained. And I think that is where you need kind of reforms. And I think that balance of power between the legislature and the executive needs to be fixed in some way so that the parties can be responsible. And I think that was fundamental. New York has a very strong governor statutory scheme with regard to how the budget process works. Other states have different ones where the legislatures have more power. I don't have a bias one way or the other. The result is what you have to look at. So if the result is bankruptcy, if the result is overspending, then how do we reform that process? And those are the biggest differences. Otherwise, I see lots of the things are the same. When it comes to the private sector, look, The private sector, could they be more vocal? Yes, but they only can be as vocal as they're going to get a response.
Yeah.
Right. What's important also is transparency, and the press has a very big role in showing things, not being, what I see is you don't see the amount of transparency or focus on governmental action because it's not sometimes as, provocative.
It's not sexy.
It's not sexy.
Being a fire starter is better.
Yes.
Just piss somebody off. Look at how unfair they're treating so-and-so.
So you want to be provocative. We live in a culture now where it's clicks and you want to create sensationalism. And sometimes, governing is not, that interesting to people.
Well, I actually challenged that. This is a pretty successful podcast. And I don't think what we say here is that sexy. We talk about that. But I think when you're trying to sell something like at retail level, you need to be. And I think the press does have this chip in their operating system that says you need to, the whole point is being a fire starter because something unfair is happening. Yeah.
You also need the information, which I think is also part of it. Because some of the reforms are about transparency. It's right. You shouldn't be able to hide the fact that you're issuing debt to fund government for 16 years. And then all of a sudden you fell off a cliff, right? That should have been open and known. And if you don't have that information, you're not going to know. So some of it is, this needs to be very public, right? There was a time when I was a little critical about some of the government actions, right? And then I was criticized.
Are you here? Or you mean here?
Here. Critical about the government's actions. And, someone in the government says to me, well, you can't be that critical publicly, and I'm like, no. We have to be critical. We have to publicly acknowledge when we see something that is wrong or raise it to the public level so we can have a public discourse about it.
So you haven't been that public, though. I mean, the board's profile now is very different than when I was in it.
I don't view the role of the board to be just critical, right? I view it as, if we see a problem, then we need to figure out a solution and how can we be part of solving it, not just to be critical. Now, I think we're in a different place. Post-bankruptcy, we're dealing with the symptoms of the lack of fiscal responsibility, which was all the debt, right? But the root causes are still there. And that is the difference where we are focused now, where the board is how do we deal with the root causes of how you got there? Some people will say, well, now that the debt is restructured,
we can go back, buddy. That's the whole point.
The job is done. Yeah. And, and that's the point. The point is that's just dealing with the symptoms. But if you don't fix the root causes, you're going to go back there. So I view everything that we're doing right now is, how do we get to the root causes and change it so that we don't go back?
Before we go into that, how did you end up in the board? Did you get kicked out of New York and this was your consolation prize?
No, actually, I was, budget directors are never the most popular people, but I actually had a pretty good reputation when I was in New York, and I worked on both sides, and I think the governor didn't want me to leave. The governor that I was working for at the time. What's
her name?
Governor Hochul.
Hochul.
Yeah, and we still have a very good relationship today, and we speak on occasion. And so I wasn't planning on leaving. I was the longest budget director. The average budget director was there for about 2.5 years historically. I was there 7. I was the longest budget director in over 50 years. And so it was, at some point, right? Yeah. It was time to go, but I wasn't looking to leave. One of the board members, Dr. Betty Rosa.
Oh, she's on the board of the university, right?
She's the chancellor of the education system for New York. She's Puerto Rican. We were adversaries sometimes because she had an agency and I was the budget director, and we didn't always, always give them all the resources that they wanted.
Because they want all of them.
Because they want a lot of them.
They think the university is the whole world.
So, but she called me up and said, would you be interested? And I hadn't thought about it at all. I had actually, when Promesa was first formed, I remember, oh, that's interesting, right?
You found it interesting.
Yeah. I said, no, well, I said this concept of like, what are they doing here? This is interesting, right? I wonder, would I be interested in serving on that board or anything like that? I thought about it in my head, never said anything, was probably just reading about it. And then fast forward, right? Years later, I get the call from Dr. Rosa. I said, that is interesting.
And that was for the executive director position, not a board seat.
That's right. It was for the executive director position. It was, like I said, I had already been budget director for 7 years. I was thinking about, do I want to do something different? And I got that call, and I thought it was very interesting to me. And I met with David Skeel, had dinner with him. I wanted to meet all of the board members, which I did. So I separately met with each individual board member because I wanted to understand who they were, what they wanted. I wanted to make sure that I was going to be able to do the right thing and make sure that I was not part of some, ideological view of what should be happening. Like, I'm a budget director. I've done this stuff for a long time, and I want to make sure that I can do the right thing and not just be the Puerto Rican who is going to be the executive director, right?
Yeah.
And we're still going to do that. And that is, what has happened. So I sat on it, I prayed on it, I meditated on it, and
you got hammered on it.
And I decided that this is what I'm supposed to be doing now. And it was not ideal in the sense that I wasn't looking to go from being the crazy budget director to, an easier job, which this is not. This is, harder than that was.
What do you mean by ideological thing?
There is, if you read like a lot of the reports, right? People think that, there's an ideological bent or that it's partisan. And I wanted to
I know what you mean.
From the board member's perspective, right? Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that's not what I was walking into. And it's not. What we have on the board are experts and people who actually want to do the right thing. Now, right, what the right thing is, depends on people's opinions.
Yeah.
But we have a bankruptcy expert. We have pension experts. We have a budget director, former budget director. We have an education expert, right? And I can tell you that all of these people care about the future of Puerto Rico. And they care about how can we be successful. And for Promesa to be successful, we have to know that this is not going to happen again. And we have to know that you're going to leave Puerto Rico in a better place than when Promesa was started. And you have to make the decisions for the right reasons. And I weigh that responsibility very heavily, particularly because the undemocratic nature of the Promesa board, right? It's something that I sit with every day. And knowing that, I have to pay special attention to making sure that, are we doing this for the right reasons? Is this the right decision? Am I collaborating with the elected government officials? And I view that as extraordinarily important. We may disagree, but it's very important for me to know where the governor is, know where the legislator is, and to communicate what we are doing and why, and allow people to challenge that. That's okay. We may end up in a different place, but I want everyone to understand why we are making these decisions and communicate them.
When I was on the board, we saw the board as political opposition. Like, not I wouldn't say like partisan in the Republican, Democrat, PNP, Popular sense of the way, but there was this feeling that they wanted to hurt the governor electorally. Again, that things that were done was for that purpose, just for the sake of just hurting him electorally or politically. And I remember when Natalie quit, I was in a couple of media, apariciones mediática, and I would say the next person needs to be willing to work and talk with the elected leaders, not talk at them and work against them because they just know better. But there's an ideological composition. There's an ideological element to the board in the sense that I think it comes out of a lack of trust at the congressional level for the electors in Puerto Rico. I don't think that's why I try to tell people the board is not a judgment on politicians. It's a judgment on the electorate. They said, we just don't trust you're going to vote for the right people.
The first thing was there's two parts to promesa. The way I view it, it was you don't have access to the bankruptcy courts, and you have unaffordable debt. What are we going to do about it? Well, we can give you access to the bankruptcy courts, and then you can have an opportunity to restructure your debt. In return for that, you have to reform the process and have this oversight board, right? And that's kind of where we are today. We've restructured a large part of the debt, but have we done the reforms? And on the reform side, I don't think that is something that the board can dictate. It's something that the government has to recognize needs to happen. And then we have to figure out the best way to do that. If we don't get those reforms, if those reforms don't happen, right, Promesa is going to be here and the board's going to be here longer than it should be until those things happen. Because at the end of the day, we need to go back and say, not only is the debt restructured, because a lot of people lost a lot of money.
Yeah.
Right? Billions and billions of dollars in wealth evaporated, right? As a result of the restructuring, which was a result of people being irresponsible, right? And taking on this debt. We go back and say, we fix that. The people of Puerto Rico should not have to pay for the irresponsibility that occurred as a result of some government officials who made bad decisions. And we have a process going forward where there's going to be more accountability, more responsibility, more transparency so that this doesn't happen again. There is some ideology in the creating of that statute, but math is not ideological, right? Accounting rules are not ideological. And people know that in your own home, right? You know, I have bills, I have to pay them. I can't spend more than I have to pay the credit card eventually. Should be the same thing for government. And at the end of the day, the government's mismanagement is landing on the people of Puerto Rico. And what the oversight board is actually take away, right, some of that debt and reduced it, right, dramatically. And that's the fight we're in right now on the energy company, right? And the PREPA.
Are you afraid of failure? I saw an interview you did with, ¿cómo se llama? Albi, with Albi Ferrer Rangel. Yeah. And he said, I didn't see any metrics in your contract. Yeah. I was like, that's a cute question. Yeah. But what is your measure of success, though? Yeah.
I haven't failed at anything that I've set out to do.
There's always a first time, right?
Yeah, there is. and I don't say that because I don't say that it's not possible, but what I'm saying is you have to keep grinding away at it until you get it done. And it is if Promesa fails, it's going to be bad for all of Puerto Rico. Yeah. So that is why it's like the failure is all of us. And when I say all of us, it's the legislature, it's the executive, and it's us working together. And I think all the tools are in place for us to do that. And I think we're making progress. I do believe, right, we've made a lot of progress with the debt. We're going to make progress with regard to the energy company. The reason I'm concerned about where we are in terms of the energy transformation is because that can't fail. It's not an option. We have to do it. And we have to do it by working together. And that's why I'm bringing all the people together. So this is not an option. It's not an option. It's just there's too much responsibility and there's too much at stake.
Going back to this idea of I call it the Title II board versus Title III board, because Title III was obsessed with restructuring, and that's done. I know PREPA's out there, and I thought we were going to talk more about it, but I know now it's all back in mediation on that. So I don't think there's anything constructive they can get out of you there because you're going to be quiet because of the negotiation. But do you think that? Let me see how I ask this. Like, what I think you've explained that the goal now is maybe to reform the budget system and the spending and fiscal system so that it reflects a government that's operational. Is there an issue where the Title II board, it's turning into basically a backstop for all the irresponsibility that is maybe politically, it's political opportunism, right? I can just say the board stopped me. right? Versus trying to integrate that in. I met with a senator. He told me that there was a discussion with the board for approving this year's budget because they wanted to include language that said that any new measure needed to be scored before and he thought that was horrible because then it would be an impairment to their legislative powers. It's interesting that they think legislative powers include spending more than you actually have. But like, how do you see that Title II board moving forward?
Yeah. The Title III aspect, I have a lot of respect for that because even working on the PREPA side of it, it does suck the oxygen out of the room.
Yeah.
It's a very intensive process.
Yeah.
And you needed to get the anchor of that debt.
And the people are douchier too.
There's a lot of people there.
The lawyers, the bankers, the FAs, they're all very douchey.
Everyone is the smartest person in the room. It's amazing. But you need to get that anchor off of the people of Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
First. And now we're in that next phase, which is what you're talking about. And I actually give credit to the legislature for agreeing to the language that we did put in the budget this year, which has never been in there before, which actually says that any new bills that you pass have to be scored and have to be within the framework of the budget in order for it to be compliant. And I believe that's the first step in the recognition that there is one budget, right? There's not one budget plus whatever else we want to do, right? It's the same money that's paying for it. And we worked hard in getting that language in a collaborative way. It wasn't the ideal language. We changed it based on conversations, and they agreed. The question is, how do we formalize that now going forward, that recognition? And I think we're starting to get there. And I think if there is a desire for the board to exit, we have to have that real conversation. And we're starting to have it now. And I think now, we agreed to that budget, and then they passed, right? They overrode the governor, $500 million. Then they passed another bill, which has cost $200 and something million, right? And that goes against, right, what that language is. But those were done before. So we'll see. The session ended on June 30th. We'll see what happens next year. But I think we're starting to, they're at least starting to recognize it, but the actions speak louder than literally the words that they put in the budget. So we'll see what happens going forward. And I hope to take that agreement and use that as the foundation for a budget reform process.
You talked about the smartest people in the room. There's always been a discussion about who runs the show, if it's the consultants or if it's actually the board. Who runs the show?
It's definitely the board. In my experience, the consultants are there to assist us.
Do they think that? Do they know that? Have they needed to be told that?
Not by me. Like I've been doing this for a long time, and I've never had an experience where the consultants are driving any kind of policy, any kind of decision making. So it is clearly not the case. It is the board, and it is, and we have a staff, and we have a staff of directors. 99.9% of the staff, nacieron en Puerto Rico, they live here. They care about Puerto Rico, and that is the staff that makes up the board staff. So we have professionals, lawyers, accountants, the directors, who the advisors report to are all from Puerto Rico, and they all were born here, right, and live here. So that is the board that I've been working with, and the advisors, are behind that. So I'm not sure what happened right before, but I can tell you my experience, and that's where we are today.
Do you think going back to the legislature and the governors, do you think there's a moral hazard for the board where we just rely on you? Because I have, and I gave you this example in the notes I sent you. Rexford Tugwell, when he was governor of Puerto Rico, he set up at least in that period, that's when the basic architecture of the government of Puerto Rico was set up. He wanted a planning board that had similar powers that could just stop, any work from the legislative branch if it didn't allocate to the plan that planning board would set up. He drafted like a model constitutional amendment that would create this national planning board doing the same. So I see the board and it reminds me of those plans he had. And is there a moral hazard that people just say, you know what, maybe we do need a fourth branch and just keep it around. We can keep playing at going to talk shows, passing bills to help the people, and we just get used to it. You think that moral hazard is there?
PROMESA established an oversight board, not a control board. Control board would be able to implement, execute, and actually do some of the things that you're talking about. DC had a control board. New York City during the fiscal crisis had a control board. This is an oversight board, so it's different. Doesn't have all of that power. Are there moral hazards? Yes, but that would also imply that the board, if the board wasn't there, then they would act responsibly, right? And they're doing it because we allow them not to. And while that's an interesting proposition, 16 years of history between 2000 show that that's not the case, because the board wasn't here and the government was acting irresponsibly. So we have to get to a place now where we're going to slowly allow the government to do more and allow, like, we're oversight. But that's why I say in this year's budget, right? Watch what happened. We passed the budget. We thought it was great. And then all of these things happened afterwards. And is that happening because the board is there and we're going to say no? I don't believe that's the case. Do you? Like, do you think that if the board wasn't there, they would not have passed that additional spending?
No, the moral hazard, maybe I wasn't precise or I didn't explain it correctly. Mm-hmm. The moral hazard is not that they didn't screw up before. Mm-hmm. It's that they don't have to learn the lesson because you're there to take care of it.
Yeah.
That's the hazard. And that's exactly my worry, that I always thought that if the elected officials were the ones that had to stand before Swain, they would learn really quickly. Having the board there doesn't it just gives you an out. I think that's the moral hazard for me. It gives you an easy excuse always.
Sure. I believe, like the statute says, the board has to go away. The board has to end. And that's where we are. It can't end if we haven't changed the processes and there's not a path for fiscal responsibility. So when you talk about whether or not the legislature is going to learn, it's not just the legislature, it's government generally. There are not institutions here in place that reflect the institutions that are in states across the country.
What do you mean?
That act responsibly. Limitations on, I'll give you pension bills, for example. Mm-hmm. In New York, before you even considered a pension bill, there was like 2 or 3 actuaries in the state who were allowed to score them. They scored them for 20 years. They had to get it from the pension board. And people had to know that they were voting on something that was worth $5 billion.
Like it was in the rules of the Senate or something like that?
It was in the statutes. It's in the laws.
Okay.
Right. And there were constitutional limitations on what can be done with regard to the budget and how you can amend the laws. You couldn't consider a bill that spent while you were considering the governor's budget. So during that period of time,
there's no spending bills.
There's no spending bills, right? You had a period of time. This is the budget. We have to work on the budget now. There are no spending bills. There's nothing else going on. That was constitutional, right?
There was right. There's a section, I think that was in, I read this as until the budget is approved, nothing else can get approved. That was a rule.
No other appropriations are allowed. No other spending, is allowed during that period. And it was respected, right? It was a time where, and this was followed. And I know because I worked on the legislative side, right? And I worked on the executive side. There are a lot of pieces like that. If you put this puzzle together, right, can make it for a more responsible process. And for all of the places that had fiscal crises, they all had similar experiences where pre-fiscal crisis, they didn't have all of these things in place. Post-fiscal crisis, in order to return to the capital markets, in order to show that they learned the lessons that came out of the crisis, they had all of these reforms. And that's where we are in Puerto Rico. We just have to now get to that place where we're not asking PROMESA under PROMESA, and what the board is doing now is not asking Puerto Rico's government to do anything more than what is done in all of the other states that are operating, all of the other governments, including local governments, right? Because we're not just talking about states, you're talking about municipalities as well. This is common practice. And while in the economy, it's when the economy slows, when you have a crisis or the economy, you're in an economic downturn, that it tests the strength of your fiscal discipline, right? When it's growing, it's fine, right? We can keep spending, everything's going. There's always going to be an economic downturn. And when that happens, that's when you have to have some kind of restraint on spending and some kind of fiscal discipline, or you can raise taxes. Raising taxes is always an option. But the question is, right, do we think there's the capacity for that now? Puerto Rico before, I think, didn't make those choices, right? We can have the taxes that we want, and we can also have the spending that we want, and then we can just borrow. And that's what resulted in the bankruptcy. And I don't want to dwell on the past. You have to look forward, but you have to remember what happened so we can figure out what the path is going.
What are the markets telling you?
Yeah.
You made a statement at one point saying markets are, I'm paraphrasing, you said something like markets are, they're at peace because we're here.
Mm-hmm. The markets feel comfortable that there's fiscal restraint and fiscal responsibility because the board is there making sure that the budgets stay in line and that happens.
So the markets agree with me, Robert.
When the board goes away, right, they need to know that there are things in place. And that's actually what I believe like the mandate is right now, is I want to go to the market and say, look, we're doing these changes. These are the things that are going to happen. And that's what happened in New York City. A lot of the changes that made post the fiscal crisis were actually in the bond covenant documents. Mm-hmm. So in order to go back to the capital markets,
Moses.
You had to put all these things in the markets. Mm-hmm. And then those got transferred into law. And then those become part of the process going forward. Even, this concept of modified accrual was important in order to maintain fiscal stability there. And it is something that New York City has had to live with, and they've lived with well, and they've managed to do that. And it forces a level of responsibility. So I don't think these things are hard. And I actually don't think Puerto Rico is any worse off than any of these other places were. The question again becomes, what do we do going forward? And are we willing to make the reforms and changes that are necessary? The inability to do that will extend the time that the board is here.
When you came in, I saw a change in the fiscal plan. I'm one of the 5 people who reads through it every year. Mm-hmm. What was that about? I was actually very happy with the change. And I think the new one is even better than the last one. The last one was 3 volumes, still had some of the mumbo jumbo. Mm-hmm. This one is more like an extended budget. What was your approach for that? I mean, was it you? Did you change it or?
With the board, right? I came to a different perspective and I talked to the board about it.
I think it's very clear that every time you do something, you need to get 7 other people to say it's okay. We understand that.
But yes, I think if you're focused on our main mission, right, is fiscal responsibility. And what are the root causes of the bankruptcy? So I took a step back and said, how did we get here? And what caused it? And in 2018, there was a General Accounting Office report that was done, and it was actually in promesa. In promesa, it said, the General Accounting Office needs to do this report. Yeah. Right? And in 2018, that report came out. And it said the root causes of the crisis so that we can, and then what reforms are necessary. So I went back to that and said, let's go look at what they said. Right?
I mean, it's written on a piece of paper.
It's a report that was issued. And we're so focused on the Title III, right? We're so focused on the debt that let's go back to what caused this to happen. Lack of fiscal discipline, overspending every year, policy decisions that were disconnected, right, from fiscal reality, right, and the debt. So, okay, so how are all the things in the fiscal plan geared towards that? And that's what I looked at. And some of them, they're nice things to do, right? but they weren't focused on that one goal. And I view it as if you're focusing on 100 different things as priorities, nothing is a priority. So let's get to the root cause and then how we fix that. And that's what that fiscal plan reflects that. It'll be modified, and there are a lot of different things that we need to work on that are focused on this main objective, but the main objective is the things in the root causes, and then how do we fix that? How do we make sure that those things don't happen again? Debt restrictions on the amounts of spending that you can do in a responsible way, building reserves so you have them for an economic downturn. Those are the priorities. And that was the change in the fiscal plan. Not that everything that's in there are all valuable things, but I wanted just to refocus on the central mandate.
Was there pushback on the change?
No, not at all, actually. Actually, I think they recognized it was the time to make the change, right? Mm-hmm. Because before it really was focused around Title III. It didn't matter if you did some of the reforms, because if you had to pay back all this debt, it was going to be impossible. We were spending 25 to 30 cents of every dollar to pay back the debt. Yeah. Right? It's strangling. So the focus, rightfully so, was we need to get that down. We got it down to like 6 or 7%. Now we need to focus on the budget.
Who owns the document? Like where is it? It used to be fiscal plans are owned essentially by the consultants. They have the draft, they have the models. Like, where's the fiscal plan now? Like, is there somebody at the board now who's like head of the fiscal plan?
Yes. So there's someone that's their responsibility is to do it. And again,
is it Ginolli?
Yeah. And the advisors, first of all, I do it mostly.
And my observation is relevant to the state government as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. Like, at least when I was there, like, who owns? Like, somebody needs to own this stuff. Like, this is my job.
Yeah. So in my background, we drove it. And when I was budget director, right, it's the staff. Mm-hmm. It is us who drive it. There are people who are basically following our direction and our scribes and are putting it together, and we're asking questions. I brought that model here, and I wanted to make sure that it is the staff. It is the people who have a stake in Puerto Rico, who are going to live here. Their families are going to live here. They're the ones who are driving this. Mm-hmm. And that is who runs it. So it is not driven by any advisors while I'm here.
No more robot cars in the fiscal plan.
I've heard about that story. I don't know enough about it.
What about the new board? Mm-hmm. You think does it reflect a change in policy? Is New York taking over Puerto Rico? You're a New Yorker. Betsy's a New Yorker. Luis Ubiñas, I think, is a New Yorker. Mm-hmm. Is Sabatella a New Yorker?
He may be.
Yeah. He sounds New York. Mm-hmm. Gonzalez, New Yorker.
Luis is not. I think he's actually doesn't live in New York. But it reflects the focus on where we're heading next. And I focused on the fiscal side, and there's like 3 parts to this. Mm-hmm. There was the Title III, get rid of the debt. There's the fiscal responsibility. But then there's also the economic part, Title V, right, which we haven't spoken about. And that talks about critical infrastructure projects, and you're not going to be able to maintain fiscal discipline if you don't have economic growth. And that reflects some of the new board members as well, right? They have an experience on the economic development side, on the business side, and that is the next stage. So we have the debt restructuring, which is still ongoing. We have the fiscal discipline part and the governmental part on structure. But then you need tax revenues, right? And you need the economy to be growing. And now you have people on the board who are focused on, who have that expertise. And it's really just to give fresh eyes, right? How do we grow the economy in Puerto Rico, right? And how do you maintain that? And how do you have businesses grow here and think that it's okay? And that's why I go to the energy part. It's a condition precedent, right? You have a functioning, right,
you would think,
electrical grid. But that new board, or the new members of the board, I think reflect that. And I think that's why it's important to have board members who understand and are experts and are not political. And I think that is, right, the smart decisions on who they appoint to the board, they've continued the past practice of putting on people who are experts in different areas who can contribute to the growth.
Do you expect any surprises with the remaining 3 seats? Because there's a toss-up there, right? Mm-hmm. David's not coming back. Mm-hmm. Andrew and Nixon, I think, would probably come back. Yeah. But it's possible that 3 new people completely, where's that right now?
Yeah. I don't know. And that is part of the political process, right? And who the appointing authorities are. Based on my background, I think I can work with any board members. And I have confidence that the people that will be selected, right, are going to have, right, the best interests of the people of Puerto Rico, and they're going to listen to, what the staff and what I bring forward to the board. Mm-hmm. So I'm not concerned about it. I mean, we'll take direction from the board. But I think what I'm seeing in the board members so far has been really great in the sense that they bring a lot of knowledge and skill set, and they also have cared about what the government says, right, and what we're saying.
How much is DC involved with what the board does? In my day, you would get a call of someone from whoever, and they would say, Christian, so-and-so from Treasury called, they're really mad. Mm-hmm. Or somebody from this office at the Congress called, they want to see this. Does that still happen? This DC, is there distance between DC and the federal government and the board, or is it more hands-on? What's that relationship like?
They're not giving direction. I check in with them because I want to get a sense what was the intent, right? Sometimes of what we wanted to do. I hear from members of Congress, right, who monitor what's going on. I also want to engage with them so that they know what we're doing, right? They're the creators of Promesa. They drafted it. So I want to make sure we're doing what the intent was, right, of the legislation. And I want to get a sense as to, there are different things we work on with them. For example, there is this new international tax that's
Pillar 2.
Pillar 2.
There's a report today on it.
Is there?
On Puerto Rico, yeah.
Okay. So on Pillar 2, I want to make sure that we're coordinating with Treasury, right? Because they have a role. I want to make sure they're understanding how important this is for Puerto Rico, which they do. And we may have a different interest, right, than some of the states have with regard to that. And they listen. And they are, right, listening and being very, very constructive. In other aspects of it, I am making sure that they understand, sometimes what they read in the newspapers is different than maybe what's really going on. Or there's a different explanation as to what's going on. And I reach out proactively to make sure that I'm communicating what we're doing. Different members of Congress. Okay.
White House,
different members of Congress, different members right there. There are liaisons to the White House, and I meet with them regularly. I speak to them regularly. And again, they actually are not giving direction, but their input is important to me to get a sense as to, do they think we're heading in the right direction? Are we making progress? I also like to let them know where we are with regard to the fiscal plan. What did we mean when we put the 209 language in there? What is our intent there? So I want to, again, I've said this before, communication is extraordinarily important to me, that people understand what we are doing. And that people means the people of Puerto Rico. It means the press. It means the legislators and the government. It means Congress. It means the executive, right? I want them to understand it. There may be disagreements, right? We may have to talk about it, but it's important for me for everyone to understand why we are making these decisions and where we are going.
Do you coordinate with the state government? It would always rile me up when somebody would call me from Treasury and they say, "Oh, we spoke with Nally about this." Like, "Oh, you're talking about us," and we're not in the room.
Yeah.
What? You understand what I'm saying?
Always. I view that as a critical part of what we are doing. So I always, before we even send a letter, because we send a lot of letters.
A lot of letters. So many letters.
Yeah. I've never sent that many. I've never signed more letters than when I've come here.
Everything's a letter.
I never sent a letter, I think, before. But I've changed the tone in the letters, and I think that's visible. The government has seen that. And that was one of the things when I first got here, I met with the governor.
You think that was a mistake, all the letters, the tone of the letters written by lawyers?
Yeah. Look, I don't know how those letters, I just know what I'm willing to sign.
Yeah.
If my signature is going on something,
you read it.
I read them.
Yeah.
Every single one. And I want to make sure I'm comfortable with those words because words matter. I also want to make sure that I don't believe this is not a pen pal exercise. So I believe that I want to communicate why we're sending this letter. Some of them we have to send for legal reasons. We have to send them in order to preserve the ability to litigate when we have to. So, but I've changed the tone, and I communicate before. I may call when you say, "Do you do it with the government?" And the answer is yes. I'll call up the government and say, "Look, we're going to be sending you this letter. It says this. This is what the tone is. Just want you to understand." And I do that on a regular basis, and that's changed. If we're going to talk on Pillar 2. We are the ones that kind of brought everyone together. And we said, let's bring Treasury in. Let's bring the government in. We're going to be there too. Just so where we end up on this is something that we all agree on. So we're not at the end saying, well, we don't think we should do this. We don't think we should do that. Collaboration is extremely important to me. That's what I have always done. So my entire career has been about, is how do we collaborate between everyone? Because at the end of the day, the board has the ability to impose certain things, but that is not success at the end of the day. At the end of the day, we have to be able to step back. So I want everyone to get there without the board. And that way we can take the step back and then we can be done with what we're doing. When we see irresponsible things, when we have to step in, that's because things aren't working. And I don't view that as a positive.
What do you think you've been here for a while. What are narratives that you think are incorrect or they're fake when it comes to discussing the board? I gave you for me the clearest example. The board works for the bondholders. Bondholders hate the board passionately more than I do. What's another kind of narrative like that you think it's just bullshit?
Well, I can only speak to since I've been here. Yeah. Right. And since I've been here, the board is okay. The one I would probably say is this austerity construct. Okay. So I think that's one where, the board's all about fiscal, austerity. And I don't think that's true. In the beginning, we're spending more than you have, like in resources, right? That's not fiscal austerity. It's just about living within your budget. Now going forward.
That one blows my mind too.
Yeah.
Because I'm sympathetic to what a lot of the people that say that, what they mean, I think, and like how they are as people, they're probably like the biggest bleeding hearts I've ever met. Like I feel bad for them because they're always so compassionate. And I'm like, at one point you need to turn it off or you're going to go crazy. But when they say it's pro-austerity, I'm like, we can't spend more than X amount. We just don't have the cash. Like what do you think they're referring to? Like, is it an issue of priorities more than spending within budget? Like, I don't get it.
I think in the beginning was a recognition had to happen that you were spending more.
Yeah.
Right. Because there's this concept that it's the bondholders, it's the debt. Right. And I think people need to understand it was overspending and that had to change. And I think that's what it was. And then it becomes priorities. And I think that's why right now what we're doing is important, that we are making investments going forward in a responsible way, right? Medicaid was expanded in a responsible way. We are making investments in infrastructure in a responsible way. We are making investments in human capital through the civil service reform, right? But in a responsible way. That's not a political way where it shouldn't be that every political season, right, bills are passed to give people raises. Yeah. That is not a way anyone functions, right? Any other government functions. Those are the things that
really, because you see some I mean, I follow blogs that are big on fiscal policy, and you get this right now. You get all these reports about how such and such county or state is doing raises or stuff like that. Like, is it not universal though? Like,
I don't think that's universal, because we did patent bargaining when I did it. We did it with what was the percent that we had in the budget, and then we lived within that. And it wasn't this union this, that union this.
Did you have unions?
There's a process.
Do you have public sector unions when you worked in New York?
Yeah, so New York is a heavily unionized public sector.
Are they equally annoying?
They can have a lot of influence. I had very good relationships with them.
Yeah.
So, and in a responsible way, but they necessarily didn't like dealing with me. This is because I had to keep the budgets in line. And if we're only growing the budget by 2% a year, right, then you can't grow contracts by 6 and 7% a year. You have to live within that framework. And we did, and they did. And we always came to responsible agreements and deals. But it was because they had to deal with the executive, who had to deal with the budget. The legislature had no role in union contracts.
None?
None. In the end of the day, the bargaining would happen between the executive and the union, and then that would have to get ratified by the legislature because they have to do the appropriation. But they did not interfere with the agreements that were made, and they did not pass different spending bills.
Yeah.
And that is a big difference. But that being said, I do believe that we have to make it's unfair that there haven't been any raises for an extended period of time. There's a reason for it, because you have to fix the budget.
Well, it's unfair in some cases. In other cases, be happy you're still getting paid.
Across the board, right? Without any kind of, and that's why it should be based on merit. It should be based on, what work people are doing. And that is where we are today. But the point was about this austerity construct.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, I think the budgets are now increasing. This year's budget increased by 3%.
Yeah.
And it's because we have the resources to do it. And now we're making investments in the smart areas. If you did what the legislature wanted to do this year, the budget would have increased by 10%. That's where the fiscal discipline comes in, right? It is not the objective to spend every single dollar you have, and then we'll worry about next year, and worry about next year. That's what's irresponsible. Growing the budget by 3% makes sense. Making strategic investments in areas makes sense. Healthcare, education, in the places that you want. Leaving resources available for tax cuts, if possible, which we were able to do.
Can I ask you on that one? Why didn't I get my tax break?
You didn't get it?
Well, I got my check.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But the code wasn't amended so I can expect it forever.
Sure.
Because I think the income tax rates in Puerto Rico, the jumps are way too severe.
Yeah. You have to look at the entire tax code. And I think part of this is instead of doing something that's politically popular at one time, let's look at the overall impact. And when it came to that tax reduction proposal, it was close to $1 billion in year one. It would be like $5 billion or over $3 billion, right? Over multiple years. So that's $3 billion that would be taken out of the budget that wouldn't go to all of the other areas where people say, right, we're not making the right investments. So the construct was, there are additional resources this year. Let's give everyone the benefit of that, give that back to people. If we want to do tax reform, then let's do tax reform and look at overall the tax rates on the business side, the personal income tax side, and make priorities, right? Where do you want, if you have $1 billion to cut taxes, where should they be cut? Should they be cut on the business side? Should they be cut on the personal income tax side? Should it go someplace else? But doing that in the absence of having like the real conversation means that you were just going to make this decision, throw out $1 billion, and then you would.
But justice, Robert, justice.
Yeah. Well, justice for who? Justice for you.
I mean, I would have enjoyed it, but I make money, so I'm good. Mm-hmm. But other people, they make less money as I do, substantially less. Mm-hmm. And they're in my same tax bracket. I think that's weird.
So I think that is a reform that we can work on, right? Because that is that cliff, right?
Yeah.
There is that, you get to the top bracket very quickly in Puerto Rico, right?
I'll give you another example. I've been in the top tax bracket since the first year I started practicing law.
Yeah.
But my income has gone up. And so I was in the same top tax bracket my first year as an attorney as I am now, 10, 11 years later. And then people that make less than I made back then are also in that same tax bracket. I think that's weird.
Yeah. And I think the board recognizes that, because when we looked at this reform, we said that is a problem, right? You get to $60,000
and boom,
top bracket, and you're in that.
And if you're married and you're both actually broke because you're making 30 or less, but actually you get that, it's just weird.
Yeah. It needs to be reformed. And I think that is something, let's sit down and have a real discussion, right, about what those changes need to be, both on the business side and the personal income tax side, right? And there were, the other parts, we did their earned income tax credit for people on the very low end. And that's an enormous transfer payment, right? That's happening for people who are working, right, but are not benefiting from all of that income. So we have this, over $1 billion, 1.3 billion going to them. But that was a decision that was made. So at that time, a decision was made not to cut the other tax brackets, but to do the EITC. And making budgets is about picking priorities. Yeah. It is about decisions and priorities. It's not, we can't do everything. And I think that's how we got here, which is, I want to help this person, I want to help that person, I want to help that person. And you do it for everyone, and you didn't actually pick and choose. Picking and choosing is the harder part, but that's where the discipline comes in. And that's where we hope, right, we can change how we move forward.
We've spoken about last subject. We'll spend some time on it. We spoke about the board ending and what to go there. And I noticed, and we spoke about this when we met the first time, the fiscal plan, the one that was certified a couple of weeks ago, has the largest discussion that the board has actually had in writing about them leaving, Section 209, right? Like, why did the board put that there? Yeah. Why? And is the result of the metrics that are in that section too hard for Puerto Rico to comply? Is the goal to set a standard that we can't keep so that you'll be here forever? Like, what was the purpose of that?
Yeah. The purpose was actually the opposite of that. There's a narrative out there.
I'll give an example why that's out there. So in the section, it says that the Section 209 conditions must be satisfied for the entire territorial government, which is defined in PROMESA as included all covered territorial instrumentalities, not just the central government. So that would mean every single municipality, single public corporation, the central government, and, allocated anything that gets consolidated into the CAFR, plus the municipalities, need to have 4 years of balanced budget through modified accrual, and they all need to have market access at reasonable rates. Somebody's going to screw up eventually. Of the 78 at least, or one of the public corporations, it seems impossible to meet.
Yeah. So the point of putting that in is because there's been a lot of misinformation about what 209 is. The government's already had balanced budgets, whether they're really balanced, modified accrual. People forget about that requirement. So the first thing I wanted to do, and the board wanted to do, is we need, in fairness, we need to provide clarity as to what the statute actually says. What you just read to me, that is in the law. That is not the board making that up. That's what the law says presently.
Well, the law doesn't say all the entities. It just says when the covered territorial government needs to be blah, blah, blah.
So the covered territorial government includes all of the covered entities.
No, they're entities.
Yeah. Well, then and that's why we wanted to have this discussion. Right? Let's look at the statute and let's look at what it says first. Realistically, right? Your point is correct. We're going to be here forever if every territorial government had to do 4 and that was the trigger, right? The board has the ability to uncover entities, right? Realistically, we will, right, eventually have to uncover entities. But there are major entities that we're working on, right, which includes PREPA, right, which is clearly, right, not even out of Title III yet. So the reason we put that language in there is because let's start with what the statute actually says. We want clarity, and then we can start saying, where are we in these areas? And I want to have a transparent discussion about where we are, right? Where we are with regard to modified accrual. The budgets are supposed to be submitted under modified accrual.
Yeah.
Right. They haven't been submitted under modified accrual. There hasn't been like a discussion of being submitted on modified accrual. We want to make sure that by the time we leave, it's at least happening.
Do people understand what it means, modified accrual?
And that's right. And I think they don't, right?
Because we used to do cash basis, right?
That's right. And when I was in New York, I lived on the cash basis. And I know cash basis. New York City lived on the modified accrual post bankruptcy. It is not an impossible threshold. And I think Puerto Rico can do it. And it'll show.
Do states government do it? That's a question. Yeah. So this whole thing about modified accrual in Promesa comes from the DC board legislation. DC was a city with 500,000 people back then, and their budget was incredibly small. Like, do states actually operate on that basis? That's an actual question. I don't know the answer.
Yeah. There are some that operate on a GAAP basis, but New York City, let's be clear, operates under modified accrual. They have since the 70s, and they have 9 million people, right? So that is a larger than most states, and they've been operating under it successfully. And I've been talking to people who have been budget directors in New York City, right, and have managed under this, because I want to understand how can you operate that way. So it is not a standard, right? That is impossible. The point of having these things clearly in that section is to have the discussion that we're having right now, is so that people can say, in black and white, this is what it says. What do you think it says? Let's have clarity, and then let's talk about where we are today for each one of the entities. Let's talk about, right, is still in Title III. They're still, right, they're a covered entity. When it comes to the municipalities, I get it, but we also don't want municipalities to fail, right? Yeah. So in the fiscal plan this year, we talk about creating within the budget office, within OJP, right, a unit, a division to deal with municipal finances. We approved $30 million last year for essential services for the municipalities who have the most difficulty financially. That is the process. All of these are processes that we are putting in place and systems we are putting in place so that when we leave, it is not, where do we go from here? It is, we have a system in place for municipalities. We have a system in place for municipal aid that is responsible. We're not approving debt for municipalities without knowing. There are some municipalities, for example, that are they're at their debt limit right now. Yeah. And they're asking, right, for approvals. And what we're saying is, we'll approve it, but I want to know a 5-year plan, right? How are you going to do this next year and the year after? Well, we can't do 5-year plans. Okay, I get it. Then it's our responsibility to provide the technical assistance to those municipalities that are in distress, to those municipalities that it's harder for them to grow their economies because they may not have a lot of economic activity.
Do you think they're in distress? I think they cry a lot. I'm saying, distress is when you are doing your best efforts and you still can't reach. That's distress, not when you're crying.
Sure. There are some municipalities that don't have revenue growth.
And they won't have it.
And they won't.
They're rural.
Right.
Their population is elderly or it's poor, and there's nothing that's going to change. And that happens all over the world. Like, that's it. Like,
right.
There's no...
So this is a real conversation we should have, right? The big municipalities that have revenue growth, okay, they need to live within their budgets. The municipalities that don't have revenue growth, right, or actually have decreasing revenues, right? Inflation goes up, costs go up, right? Healthcare costs go up. The aging population is happening. They're taking care of them. We don't have, right? How do those municipalities survive? Is there a system in place for that to happen? And unless you acknowledge some of these things and then come up with a system by which you're going to provide the level of assistance, or you can just let them say, you got to keep cutting your budgets every year, right? Yeah. And your cycle. But at the end of the day, who suffers from that, right?
The people that live there that are poor, elderly, and they're not getting revenue growth. That's why I'm trying.
Exactly.
I remember when, this discussion drives me a little crazy because you can't treat everybody like you treat San Juan. They're not the same. And I get the feeling that we're trying to just apply the same thing to everybody.
Yeah, we're not. And that's what I'm pointing out. That's not, that's exactly what our point is that we need to, there are municipalities that act irresponsibly and they grow their budgets too fast. That's one group. But there are some, right, that they need the assistance of the central government. And the question is, fine, but we've got to make sure we're doing the right thing too, right? That you're acting then responsibly. But to your point, it's the people, right? It's not about government, right? It's about the people who that government is responsible for. And you cannot punish the people for the actions necessarily of the government. But you have to get the government to act responsibly, but you got to make sure the people are assisted. In this year's budget, we added money, for example, for the Ama de Llaves program, which helps the elderly who are aging in place. The government has responsibility to deal with that within resources. And that's why I say we grew the budget by 3%. And some of that money goes to these important priority programs, right, for the most vulnerable. The municipalities are stepping into that space in some areas. So we need to acknowledge that. But it shouldn't be in an ad hoc, random basis that's based on politics, right? In Puerto Rico, you have these, two organizations that represent municipalities based on political party.
Isn't that the norm?
No, it's not. You would have... Right?
Why would you have it otherwise?
Because they're governments and they're serving the people and they're providing services.
Yeah, you're being too technocratic, Robert.
Yeah. So...
there's a way.
And it's fine, right? If you want to have a political organization, right? It's fine. You do have that. But when you're talking about delivering government services, that should be blind to the politics. And there should not be any politics associated with whether or not this government gets for this purpose or that local government gets for that purpose. There should be formulas in place, processes in place that deal with that. But you can't help also everyone, right? Because these are my political friends. You can't do that. I'm not saying that's what's going on.
I don't think that's what happens.
And I'm not saying that's what's going on. As we realign, right, the government, we just want to ensure, we're trying to ensure. And that's why the Essential Services Fund and the governor submitted a plan to us. I
think we actually should be afraid the day they actually get together. I was at the CRIM board with them, and it's bipartisan. And they get together and they have no issues.
Oh yeah, and I've met with both of them. But I'm saying we have to deal with both of them, and I want to bring them both together and talk to them both. And they are. And I've met with both of them, and I've spoken to both of them. And the result of this year's budget, right, is a result of coming together and saying these are the needs. For example, there's $50 million in the budget to deal with the match that some of the governments needed for some of the restructuring. Funds. It's one-time cost. It helps them, right? Not have to, it's hard for them to raise that additional money. And I don't want restructuring projects to be stopped because there isn't a match. And the central government had it. And it's blind, right, to, right, who, these funds go to. It shouldn't be based on politics. I think there's, in the Essential Services Fund that was done this past year, the governor gave us a formula. It was blind to the politics, right? It went to the municipalities that need it. So let's just make sure that as we realign the budgets and we try to attempt to help the municipalities, we do it with that in mind, that there are some municipalities that need support, need more than others. And also in return for many municipalities, we want to make sure that they're part of helping the economy grow, right? They're not holding up permits. They have territorial plans that are in place because you need that for economic growth. And I want to make sure that they understand that they have a role as well.
Is it weird to you that labor laws are such a big deal here?
I mean, I'd say it's weird.
And you come from New York, which is a lib state, right? So
New York has, a certain amount of labor laws. The labor laws here are much more, right, either restrictive or I would say they're much more restrictive than they even are. Even in New York. And there's a little bit of a surprise in how it impacts the private sector. We have a lot of labor laws.
In the public sector, of course.
In the public sector. But the ones in the private sector are, significantly, they're more involved in the private sector.
But it's weird, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's unusual.
I just want somebody else to say it. I say it. Guys, it's weird. We shouldn't get this.
yeah, it's unusual. I hadn't seen it before, and it was not something that I understood until I got here.
Last question. How is the board dealing with a transition in the government? You're going to have completely new legislature and completely new governor, whichever party wins, right? Like, how are you guys dealing with that?
Yeah. Continuity is really important. What I am concerned about, the board's concerned about, is that there's a pause in continuity and things stop. Or as there's a transition, right? I know that when you have a transition of a new governor, it takes time for them to ramp up. And when you have a transition, people start to leave, right, in key places. And we can't afford, right, to have that gap, especially for the recovery efforts. So I'm having conversations with the government right now. It's like, look, let's make sure these things go in place. And you need to have, right, below the top people. And this is why actually, a functioning civil service and government structure beyond the top people is critically important, right, to keep things flowing at that level. I don't want this to be an excuse from the federal government, right, to slow down on funding because, right, things aren't happening. And it's a concern for me. I think we'll take a more active role in just making sure that there is continuity. And whenever we know who the next governor is going to be, right, I want to work hand in hand with them just to make sure that there's continuity. And to your point, you viewed the board as an adversary. I think that time is over. I think we need to review the board. I view the board as a partner in government because eventually we have to leave. And I want to partner with the new legislature, right? Whoever the new governor is, to make sure, like, this is part of 209. This is what needs to happen. These are the things that we need to do. These are in the best interest of the people in Puerto Rico. If you don't think so, then let's have the discussion as to why they are not. And then let's come to an agreement, and then let's execute so that we can be done. Ideally, that is what happens. We will challenge individual pieces of legislation. We will challenge things that we disagree. Some of those things the government welcomes us challenging. They will say privately, right? We get it, right? But we hope those become fewer and fewer as we move forward and we become a partner so that we can transition and we can all say that Puerto Rico is better off today, right, than it was. And what happened in 2016, 2015 doesn't happen again. And we have a path for the future of the economy of Puerto Rico so that people can return. People who have left Puerto Rico can come back. They have an education system that's functioning, healthcare system that's functioning, and a government that's functioning.
You need to crack the whip on Jose Ramon. Robert Mujica, thanks for coming to the show.
Thank you very much, Kristen. It's been a pleasure.
¿La pasaste bien?
Muchas gracias. Sí.
Okay. Bueno, señores, este ha sido otro episodio de La Trinchera. Como siempre, le damos gracias por sintonizar y les pedimos que por favor compartan el episodio y el programa con sus amistades, sus familiares, compañeros de trabajo y hasta con la gente que les caiga mal. Por favor, suscribirse a La Trinchera en su plataforma preferida y dejen un rating positivo 5 estrellas en la plataforma que merezca. En el caso de Apple Podcast, por favor, escribir un review bonito. Si van a decir algo negativo, se lo pueden reservar. A nadie le interesa lo amargada que es su vida. Y si desean comentar el episodio, pueden hacerlo en Spotify, en la área de Q&A, debajo de los show notes, o en la parte de comentarios en el caso de YouTube. Les aseguro que leo todos los comentarios y mensajes y los tomo en consideración. Y como siempre, le damos gracias a Eric Harper por nuestra música Spirit of España y a Claudia Rosario por nuestro arte. Nos vemos en la próxima.